turn on recording. So
Want to do that again? Okay. Are we set technical issues or?
Yeah, we're not sure.
All right. To add to the technical issues, I had trouble printing this tonight because my black ink was out and I didn't realize that. So I printed it in red. It's just been one of those days. Scott McNeil is the current director of the Frosty Drew Observatory and Science Center, located in Nittigrit Park on Charlestown. They're open on Friday nights if you want to check out that observatory, and we'll be hearing more about that in this presentation. Scott develops all the Frosty Drew campus and telescope automation, remote presentation frameworks, and the Frosty Drew website. He writes about astronomy, including a weekly newsletter on astronomical happenings for the Frosty Drew community. At Brown, Scott is a valuable member of our public outreach team at Lab Observatory, where he's been working for a number of years. And additionally, Scott has been assisting in some of our undergraduate astronomy labs, particularly with image processing and instructing the students and providing training to students on the use of our equipment. In 2020, Scott took on the role of an astronomy lab professor at Bryant University and is a partner in the Rhode Island Sidewalk Astronomers. He's a professional systems and software engineer with roots in the open source community. In addition, Scott serves as the current CEO and chairs the Frosty Drew Memorial Fund Board of Directors, and is a periodic astronomy correspondent to NPR, WJAR, and the Weather Channel. Scott also will sometimes stay up very late at night, and he told me that last night he was up all night and went to bed at 5:30 this morning. So I'm sure he's got some images to show you tonight. And somehow he finds enough time to get enough sleep and be awake to give us a nice presentation. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Scott McNeil to all of you.
Over the month of October 2021, the Frosty Drew Observatory replaced its 21-year-old Meade LX200 16-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope with a new PlaneWave CDK600, which includes a 24-inch optical tube assembly and the L600 mount. This is a time lapse of the entire project, from removal of the initial telescope to the completion of the install of the new PlaneWave CDK600. The first step of the replacement process required removal of the existing Frosty Drew Observatory telescope, a Meade 16-inch LX200 Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, which has been in the observatory for the last 21 years. Removal of the telescope had to be done in stages, with the optical tube assembly first, followed by the fork, and then the mount base. Once the mount base was removed, we were able to evaluate the existing Meade pier and decided that we did not have the correct specifications on the pier to accommodate the PlaneWave CDK600. Though the pier was much heavier than we expected it to be, we were able to remove it successfully. Once the pier that was accommodating the Meade telescope was removed, it became clear that the original pier, which held the astrophysics 7-inch refracting telescope, which was the first telescope in the Frosty Drew Observatory, that pier was still partially in place, and due to the small openings and cabling requirements of the CDK600 pier, or the PlaneWave pier, we needed to remove the old telescope pier from the pier foundation. We discovered that the original steel column was inserted into the wet foundation cement with the bottom open. The cement inside was higher than the outside surrounding plain foundation, and that required us to jackhammer and remove the cement from inside the steel column, and then cut the rest of the pier column out and machine the pier column down to a plane level surface. The cement of the original pier foundation was also not fully level and required additional grinding as well. Frosty Drew Observatory team members Mike and Derek worked diligently to get the pier foundation and the old pier column as level as possible. You see Derek holding a cardboard box. The point of this was to prevent metal shards from flying all over the observatory during the grinding process. Once completed, the pier and the metal column were perfectly level and ready to accept the PlaneWave pier. The final step of this process required the filing of all machined edges to remove burrs or possible sharp areas that could damage the PlaneWave cables. We also had to paint those edges to prevent rust from setting in. Once the pier foundation had been properly upgraded and prepared for acceptance of the PlaneWave pier, we began to install the pier itself. Installation of the pier required precise leveling, alignment with the foundation, as well as alignment with the cardinal points of our location. Anchors were inserted 10 inches into the original pier foundation, then left to cure overnight with a high-strength bonding epoxy. The pier install occurred the night before the PlaneWave installation was to take place, and Frosty Drew team members stayed over on site that night in preparations for the morning delivery of the PlaneWave telescope. On Saturday, October 23rd, the new PlaneWave CDK600 telescope arrived at the observatory at 7 o'clock a.m. First, we lowered the L600 mount into the observatory via crane and slowly attached it to the PlaneWave pier. Once attached, post-installation steps were required, which included switching the declination access limiter to the altazimuth position, and then installing the saddle to accept the PlaneWave CDK24 optical tube assembly. Once we were satisfied that the L600 mount was ready to go, we began disassembling, balancing, and lowering the CDK24 into the dome via the crane. Attaching the CDK24 to the L600 saddle was the most difficult step of the day. It required very precise balancing and attachment of the CDK24 in the L600 saddle, and we ran into a few hangups along the way. Though the hangups that we experienced were not outside of our reasonable expectations for the day, Frosty Drew team members Derek, Mike, Scott, Jessica, and Greg all assisted in performing the balance and attachment of the CDK24, while Frosty Drew team member James videographed the entire event. This concluded the installation steps of the PlaneWave CDK600.
So thank you, Bob, for a fantastic introduction. So, yes.
You need to do some share the screen.
So,
Let's see.
are we not gonna have the presentation on the thing?
He's got more slides.
Oh, okay, okay, never mind. Never mind. Sorry.
That's fine. So, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the recent experience that we went through with Frosty Drew installing the new PlaneWave CDK600 telescope. It was quite an interesting run. It was several years in the making, and we went through a lot of different ideas and processes and hang-ups to get to where we are today with it. For starters, a little bit about the history of the observatory. Over here on the left, you see the first telescope that was in the observatory. Now, this is a rather disputed image because I believe that that may be Professor Penhallow's old 4-inch refractor that he may have had on loan at Frosty Drew for a small amount of time. Though we did have the Astrophysics Starfire 7-inch 174 in there for quite a while, and this is Les Coleman over here, taking the dew shield off of that, or the lens cap. Now, I didn't have a lot of time to set up, so I'm sorry for that. So not fully working here. The second set of telescopes we had at Frosty Drew Observatory was where we took that 7-inch refractor and we piggybacked it onto a makeshift 12-inch Newtonian. And this worked well for a while until they started running into problems with the Newtonian. What specifically happened was the secondary mirror had ended up coming undone. And without proper repair, it eventually fell onto the primary, damaging it beyond use. Which sounds terrible at first, but from a point of view of public outreach, this telescope was a difficult telescope to be using. The counterweights were very large. They swung around the room in the dark. The mounting mechanism was very custom. The clock drive was very inaccurate. And the observatory at this point was not very well set up for public outreach, which was Frosty Drew Observatory's primary mission. It was in 1999 that Les Coleman had installed the Meade LX200 EMC 16-inch SCT. Now, the point of this telescope was not only to upgrade what we had in there, but was to really start bringing the concept of public outreach and public accessibility to the organization. And this telescope was so much more public friendly and much more easier for the public to utilize. It was mounted in an all-azimuth configuration. It utilized a field derotator. The platform that was in the observatory fit around it very well. And it really kind of moved Frosty Drew from that position of it's kind of like full-out geek into more of a public outreach point of view. Now, with the Meade telescope, we had some issues. Some of these issues came down to the idea that Meade built the telescope as a research-grade telescope. Now, I know you guys have one too, so you can definitely share some of my chagrin and issues with this telescope. Over time, it became clear that the drive in the telescope was not very adequate. They used a series of different, in my opinion, mistakes in building this telescope. One thing they put in is they used graphite grease on the gears. And graphite grease works really great for a little while, but then it gets hard. And once it gets hard, if you don't keep up with it, it'll start to grind away at your gears. And we eventually ended up with ruts in our gears, in our worm, and in our large declination gear. We had rebuilt the declination gear and set up a process where every winter we would rotate the declination gear 1/4. And then after doing a full rotation of 4 years, we would rebuild the declination gear again. And the reason we would rotate it is because it's an all-azimuth telescope. So the gear is only using 1/4 of its actual teeth for regular operations. Even with these modifications, we still ran into problems with it. The field derotator stopped working, and it got to the point where the only thing we could do with the telescope was either visual observation with the public or planetary imaging. And it did maintain really fantastic planetary imaging. This is an image of Saturn that we captured with it. A little off on the screen here, but that telescope did very well with planetary imaging. This was Saturn, this was last year. We captured this with the ZWO ASI 290mm, and this is 135 gigabits of data that we got that image from. So at Frosty Drew, everything we do when it comes to what we're working with, we make 3 categories to decide how we're going to do upgrades or how we're going to do programming. We the first category is effective replacement, which would be something that is very cost effective, drop-in replacements, not a lot of work, and fixes the immediate problem. Then we have the category effective upgrade, which is where we're doing a nice upgrade. We're probably going to see a good amount of work we're going to have to do. And the cost is not crazy, but it is definitely up there. It becomes very grant applicable at that point. And then we have the third category, which is pie in the sky. And the pie in the sky category is where we take the item that we want the most. We don't factor in cost, we don't factor in the amount of work we're going to have to do. We just go purely on, the awesome factor. So when we put together ideas for replacement of the telescope, about 4 years ago, our effective replacement was the Meade LX200 ACF 16-inch SCT. It would be a drop-in replacement. We'd be able to drop it right onto the pier, and the Meade Pier in there, bolt it in, be good to go. All of our systems for campus integration was already working with all of our Meade ACF telescopes. It would solve the problem. It'd be an easy grant to write because it's not that expensive. It's substantially cheaper than that 24 or the 16-inch was when we first got to EMC. But there was a lot of negatives with this. And so we have hand controller failures. I don't know if any of you guys got any of the ACF Meades, but we have 2 of them at Frosty Drew, and both of them have failed hand controllers. And the big problem, though, was dealing with Meade. And I'm going to share a story with you that had to deal with Meade. With our 16-inch, our hand controller, the little LED map light on it, ended up going out. Without that map light, we couldn't initialize the telescope. And you can't do any kind of third-party computer integration without the initialization of the telescope's computer. So the telescope is useless to us without the map light. So I got on the phone with Meade, and I have a rough history speaking with me on the phone because they never work with us. And I said, listen, can you guys send us a schematic, or at least let us send you in the hand controller to fix it? And they said no. They said we have to pack up the entire telescope and freight it back to them so they can replace the LED. And I was like, that's not going to happen. I'm like, can you at least let us know the LED part number so we can just change it on our own? And they're like, no, that's proprietary information. There was a lot more discussion on that phone call with me, which I will not repeat here. It ultimately got me banned from speaking with me. They did not even take my calls anymore. And we ended up just fixing it on our own with reverse engineering it. But we wanted to get away from that. We were done with that. So effective replacement was another Meade, which we weren't very happy about. Effective upgrade was the Officina Stellar RIDK500, which is a 20-inch Dahl-Kirkham telescope. This was what I was pushing for. It's not that expensive. The cost was comparable to what we paid for the telescope that was already in the observatory, the 16-inch Meade. It's answered all of our demands when it came to where we're trying to take the organization with imaging, with our internship program. With public outreach was a questionable item with it because the original Dahl-Kirkham had pretty big issues with off-axis observing. That's really what the corrected Dahl-Kirkham addressed. And this telescope would have put us back into the lead, again, with having the most awesome telescope in the state, which is what we had when we first put in that Meade, which is still mind-boggling me that someone would consider that telescope awesome. This is the telescope I was pushing for. The pie in the sky model was the CDK600, 27-inch corrected Dahl-Kirkham from PlaneWave. This telescope was incredibly expensive. It was incredibly awesome. It was a huge upgrade. It kind of future-proofed us, and it would easily be the most advanced telescope in the region. And from a point of view of grant writing, I was the one who had to write the grant. I was really hoping that we weren't going to go with this because I was like, the grantor is never going to give us $195,000 to get this telescope. So we got together, we got the astronomy team, we got the board of directors together, we talked about it. And I put forth my reasons for going with the Officina Stellar, and I was overruled The pie in the sky telescope is what everyone decided to go with. Doing research on PlaneWave devices, I came to the conclusion that, and I learned this actually from Brown University. Brown University, in conjunction with Frosty Drew on the Skyscrapers and Professor Britton over at CCRI, worked really hard to get the CDK600, and it just kept running into hangups. And when I started looking at the different models that PlaneWave had in researching for writing the grant, I realized that the price tag between the CDK700 and the CDK600 was a humongous difference. And when you look at all the telescopes up to that point, yeah, they're roughly double the cost, but when you're talking sub $100,000, double the cost isn't really a big deal. And you're granted, the Naismith focus mechanism, if you're not familiar with it, is a mechanism that instead of looking through the back of the telescope here on the back plane, you actually can observe from either side of the telescope, and it's almost like an integrated flip mirror in a way. And you can have different focuses set for different sides. So it's almost like parfocal, but on steroids. For our intent and purposes at Frosty Drew, the Naismith focus wasn't something we really needed, and I didn't think it would work out too well for us. So they do package the CDK700 as their public outreach telescope. It was really just a matter of 3.5 inches of aperture difference. So from a grant writing perspective, I convinced the team and the board that we should go with the CDK24 instead of the CDK27. And that would get us a very higher probability of writing the grant. Now, due to concerns during the pandemic, we had run into some interesting issues. We were writing a grant when the pandemic really kicked in. And at Frosty Drew, it really kind of hit us hard because we got stuck in a strange situation. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the pandemic, I'm sure you're all sick of it. But one of the really strange things we had to deal with at Frosty Drew was that when we were reopening and working to reopen, we were only allowed to have 25 people on our campus. And at first I was thinking, yeah, that's not a problem, that sounds fine. But then after we set up, connections and contacts at the DVR, the Department of Health, to make sure we're doing everything right. And they told us that it wasn't 25 people on our campus, it was 25 people in the entire neighborhood park. And try explaining to the general public why you can only have 25 people in a park that's over 100 acres. And people get angry. And we heard a lot of really interesting things. So during this time where we're trying to figure this out and how we're going to do it without getting everybody mad at us, we realized that we were coming really close to the due date on the grant. So I wrote Champlin and I asked them, I said, can we have an extension on the due date for the grant? And they were not very happy with the idea, and I begged them for it, and they gave us 2 days. But that 2 days was enough for us to do it. We submitted, but it was funny too, because we've got a good relationship with Champlin Foundation. They're the grantor we go to for our big stuff. And getting the extension, I had to try really hard. But when I submit the grant and they saw the price tag, I got their attention real fast. And they instantly contacted me on the day I submit the grant. And they said, you're asking for more money in this grant than the organization Frosty Drew has ever asked for us combined. What's the reason here? What's the use case scenario? So I dumped it on them. And I told them about our fantastic team of volunteers that we have and how passionate they are and how positive they are, which is also the product of us ended up with the PlaneWave, because that positive attitude pushed everyone towards the pie in the sky model. Talked about the amount of people we get in the summer outside of the pandemic, that we've seen upwards of 700 people come out weekly to the campus. That our main telescope we're afraid it's going to break. We're afraid that we're going to end up without a replacement on site, and then we're going to have an observatory dome that's just there for a novelty. They liked our reasoning. They didn't show a lot of emotion, but they said it was good enough for them to put it into the pool. And that was in April 2020. And at first, I was kind of giddy about it. People would come by and be like, hey, what's going on with that grant for that new telescope? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's really awesome. I can't wait, man. We got a PlaneWave. But then when we started getting into the fall, like the pessimist in me started coming out. And I'm not really a pessimist, but I definitely have that side where I don't like bad news. Like it really kind of drags me down. And it got to the point where I started getting combative. Like the team members would come up and they'd be like, so if you heard anything from the PlaneWave from Champlin, and I'm like, I don't talk about it, don't bring it up. And then when we got in November, we weren't getting responses, I started getting hostile. The team members would walk up and they'd be like, hey, Scott, so the PlaneWave? And I'd be like, get out, do not talk to me about that. When we got to the end of November, which is surely the latest you're going to hear from Champlin, I got very nervous and I got very stressed out because I was pretty convinced that we weren't going to get the telescope, that it was just too much. And with everything with the pandemic, it was a very busy semester with changes, with things going on. I told my partner, Jessica, I'm like, I said, I need to spend a weekend. Do we just need to unplug? So I told the team, I'm like, take over to public night this week and we're just going to head out. And I'm like, I don't want to talk about the grant. I don't want to talk about the telescope. Just let's get out of here. And we're driving through Connecticut on 95, and I see on my phone an email comes in from Champlin. And I'm like, of course, right when I leave, this comes in. I'm like, and I go to my partner, I'm like, Champlin just wrote us. And she's like, are you gonna read it? I'm like, no, I'm not gonna ruin my weekend. Are you kidding me? I need this weekend. I cannot have rejection for this weekend. But she doesn't think that way. And she's like, are you kidding me? She's like, well, I can't wait. So she grabs the phone, she opens it up, and the first word is congratulations. And she freaks out. She's like, we got the grant. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And she's like, no, we got it. They're giving us a telescope. So I pulled over on the side of 95, I read the email, and I started calling each of the people on the Frosty Drew Astronomy Team. And I was met with some really interesting responses. There was a lot of laughter, there was some tears, but the one constant response I kept getting, like Derek's my number one astronomer on the team. He's like my number one, he's like my right-hand man. I'm talking to him and he's laughing and he's going on and he's like, no, that's great, that's really fantastic. And then about 10 minutes into the call, he goes, wait, are you serious? And I'm like, yeah, he's like, we really got it? And he just couldn't believe it. And I heard this from several team members where I would tell them on the phone, like, hey, we got the grant, we're getting the PlaneWave. And a few minutes into the call, they'd be like, wait, we're actually getting it? You're not kidding? And it became such a huge deal that we didn't even know how to interpret it at that point. So we formed a team to do the removal installation. We made a list of potential issues we're going to run into. We knew there would be a lot of hidden things that we didn't expect. And we started moving forward with the project. Now, we had already worked with PlaneWave extensively in developing the telescope, and they initially told us that we were looking at if we ordered the telescope at the beginning of 2021, we can probably expect a ship date sometime in September 2021. So we gave PlaneWave, we told them we got the grant. We had the money in our account beginning in January. They're like, well, let's put a down payment down. You guys give us like 50% down payment, and then we'll see where costs go from there. And I'm like, no, we have the entire amount right now. I'm like, how about we just pay for this thing out flat? And they're like, well, not many people do that. I'm like, I don't care what people do. Let's just get it done with. And they're like, all right, fine, you can do that. So we paid for the entire telescope up front, and we told them we'll deal with shipping costs, and they came up. And then we got into the due date debacle with PlaneWave. So they came back and they said, yeah, we'll have your telescope shipped early May. You should have it installed by Memorial Day weekend. And I was like, wow, that's fantastic. Now, May came and went, nothing from PlaneWave. So we hit them up. And I'm like, oh, yeah, 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks went by, nothing from PlaneWave. We hit them up, 2 more weeks. And we heard this all the way until the end of September, which was the original ship date. But during that time period, and the reason we didn't want to do the down payment was because we foresaw this inflation problem building. And we were thinking, where's cost going to be then? What's going to happen? If we don't pay for this telescope now, we can be able to afford it, or are we going to have $110,000 sitting in our bank account that we can't spend on this? So PlaneWave actually wrote us and told us that costs have gone up a lot and that we owe them additional money. And I told them, I said, guys, we have a sales order right here. I said, as far as I see this is a done deal. You guys owe us a telescope. And they came back and they gave us a telescope for what we paid for it. which was great because after speaking with Champlin, we found out that almost every grant recipient, not everyone, but very close to every grant recipient in that year had to ask Champlin for additional funds because of inflation costs. So it was a really great strategy and it worked very well for us. This was the removal of the Meade LX200 EMC. We did it in parts. We removed the OTA, then the fork, remove the mount base, and that was pretty easy. That was no surprise. We knew how that would go. But it was when we got down to the pier, is when things got weird. We were under the impression that this was a Meade pier, but it's not a Meade pier. This is a custom pier that someone had made to handle that Meade telescope. And that pier weighed almost 400 pounds. I couldn't believe how heavy it was when we were taking it out. In this picture here, this is one of our astronomy team members, Mike. That's a picture where Mike almost died because I got the bottom, he got the top of my hand slipped off and the whole pier came down on him. And I couldn't believe he held it. For a geek, he was pretty strong. Now, when we removed the telescope, we removed the pier, we ran into a few problems. This is when our problem started beginning. The first thing we found was this. This is what was holding that Meade telescope to the cement foundation.
One.
We pulled it out with a little rock hammer.
Oh, the anchor, everything came out.
Yeah, it wasn't even in right. Now, we were under the impression that we were going to have to saw off those anchors and machine them down. One of them, I was able to almost pull out with my fingers. That telescope was not anchored. It was just sitting on that pier. And the reason why it probably never fell over is because this pier was so heavy. So that was problem number one. It was nice for us in an aspect that we didn't have to worry about shaving them off and getting them out. That was nice, but it definitely scared us a bit. Problem number two, we ran into, oh, this is great here. All right. Those who have been to Frosty Drew have probably noticed that we use 30 cents as shims because the telescope was on level. So we got our 30% or our 30 cents back that day. But that was a bigger problem that we ran into too when we started to deal with the original pier. So underneath that Meade pier was the original pier that held the astrophysics 7-inch refractor. And we assumed that the entire thing was filled with sand all the way down to the bottom of the cement. But we were wrong. What happened was we realized that when they didn't drop the column in and then pour the cement in around it, they poured the cement in and then dropped the column into the cement and then planed off the outside of the cement foundation around it. And we ended up finding that there was about 2 to 3 inches of additional cement inside that old metal column. So we had to cut it off with sawzalls to a point where we can get in there with a jackhammer. We had to drill out holes into it so we can break it apart easily. We didn't want to damage the pier either, or the foundation, because we were reusing it. And then we had to go around and jackhammer all of these out around the holes. It sounds worse than it actually was, but it was our first really big surprise that came right alongside with those nice anchors. Once we were able to get all of this out, then we were able to start sawing out the remainder of this column. When we started working on the column, we realized that this is like boilerplate steel or something they have here. And these pieces were insanely dense, and they were very heavy. Like that piece right there was about 6 to 10 pounds. I couldn't believe how heavy these things were. And sometimes I wonder if we probably could have put the PlaneWave right on that pier. Once we got the pier out, we had to start grinding. The PlaneWave pier is the reason that some people would look at this and say, wow, you guys are really anal retentive, is you really have to go to that level. But the way the PlaneWave Pier and the PlaneWave CDK or the L600 mount works is all the wires come down the center of the mount and they drop down the center of the pier and out the bottom. And then they need an adequate amount of space to spin inside there. And the idea is that the CDK doesn't have any tangle points or any strain on the wires at all, so you don't have to worry about tracking issues that may arise from that. So we had to have every surface had to be completely machined. The bottom of the pier that PlaneWave sent us as well was not open. It was a very small hole in the bottom, which was smaller than the diameter of the old pier that was in there. So even to get it to sit on their plane was a lot. Well, they had required us to really grind that down. But we had to make sure there was no sharp edges, or otherwise we could damage the cables. And then we found out why we needed 30 cents to balance our LX200. It's because the cement wasn't even level. It was actually quite off. So we had to actually machine down the entire cement surface of the pier foundation as well. It took an entire night to do it. That's Derek on the left there, ecstatic that they actually got it completely level. And this is what it looked like before we finished it off by just taking out some of the burrs and then putting some paint on it so it doesn't rust up. When you look inside, when you visit Frosty Drew and you look inside the pier, there's a big hole in one side and you can see right in there. It looks like the lunar surface inside there. So we got a little light in there, we got a little American flag sitting there, and we're gonna get a little rover and stick it in there. It looks just like the Apollo landing site. So this is a little off here, so you're gonna kind of miss out on a little bit of that, but what we're looking at here is, let me do this real fast. Let's get another tab.
Scott, what's the diameter of the dome?
Diameter of the dome, I don't know offhand. It's not, we have the R dome, which is the larger dome with the gear, not the brush motor.
Yeah.
I don't know offhand the diameter. But when we started installing the PlaneWave Pier, which is what you're missing out here, we got the pier, it dropped on perfectly, it fit perfectly on the platform. And instead of using small anchors like these, we actually installed 2-inch all-thread that were 12 inches long. And we drilled 10 inches down into the cement and dropped them in and held them with a high-strength bonding epoxy, which sat overnight. And we used 4 of them instead of the 3 that were on this. That's not going anywhere. And we were worried about that. We wanted to make sure that we had a really good spot. We were concerned about hitting rebar on the way in. And we didn't. I was actually quite surprised. I was like, you figure typically things don't really go where you want, right?
Some though, right?
What's that?
You probably should have had some.
I'm sure it's in there. I think we were lucky. I've seen the images of the pier installation, and there is rebar in the center, but the pier at one point, that foundation was built out. And I'm not sure if they had any rebar in that process. So when we drilled in, we took that into consideration. And there were several different spots on the PlaneWave Pier that you can use for anchors. And we made sure we used the ones that were inside the most. We can get into that old cement that had the good rebar in it. One of the issues we definitely ran into was getting the telescope into the observatory. So the width of that CDK24 OTA is about 32 inches wide. And our door is just under 29 inches wide. So we're definitely not going to get it in the door. PlaneWave was under the concept or the idea that 2 guys could carry this into the observatory. It weighs almost 400 pounds. I don't know who they're talking to, but we couldn't do that. I even asked them too, like, can you guys, like when they sent it to us too, they're like, yeah, you're going to need to take it off the truck yourself. I'm like, how much does it weigh? And they're like, it's 1,000 pounds. And I'm like, I can't pick that up, can you? So we had to crane it in, and we had to go through the roof. And we used a group called Thornley the Grass Rigging out of Seekonk, and they were fantastic. It was actually, of all the awesome things that happened on the install day, it was watching the riggers do their thing. That was really what was impressive. How they can move things at just like a centimeter at a time. Drop things into the dome, and like getting this telescope into the dome was It proved a little bit harder than we expected it to be. So this is the L600 mount, 338 pounds. We had to run all the cabling that we could out the bottom before we dropped it in, just to be sure that we didn't have any hangups on the way, because once it's on the pier, it's on the pier. When we dropped in the telescope, everyone was so busy with their cameras that we started getting to the position where no one was doing their job and we were getting worried about it. Once the telescope came in, this is the L600 mount. We dropped it on the platform, on the pier, and everything went great. The install didn't start running into hangups until we started getting into the installation of the CDK24. Now, the CDK24 was packaged very nicely. It cranes in very good, but it was a little tight getting through the observatory door, and it was windy. And it's always windy at Frosty Drew, so if you get a windy day, it's even worse. So dropping it in became a little daunting, but we started running into issues once it was installed, once we're trying to attach it. Problem number one, and which we heard from PlaneWave after the fact, is don't use the declination lock. So the manual clearly says do not try to attach the CDK24 without the declination lock. This declination lock could not hold away that telescope. And look how much it bent. Like it came apart when we tried to get it out, and we had to vice grip it out. And it left metal shards all inside the drive. And this is a direct drive, so it's all magnets. So metal shards are what you don't want in there. It has an encoder that takes a measurement almost 8 million times around the circle. Metal's not a good thing to have in there. So don't use the declination lock. 2, don't attempt to attach the OTA to the saddle and balance it in that configuration, because it slides out of the saddle. And it doesn't, when you lock the saddle back down, it doesn't pick it back up in there. It sits on an angle. When we asked PlaneWave about it, their response was, just be careful. I go, well, what happens if the telescope drops out? They're like, well, let's have a couple guys there to catch it. It's 300 pounds without the accessories. I don't know who they're hanging out with. We learned later that if you take the telescope and point it to the zenith, then you can work with that balancing mechanism and it doesn't drop out of the saddle. But it is still rather daunting working with a telescope that's that large, trying to get it to balance properly.
Scott, why didn't you load that onto the pier without the optics? Why didn't you just take out the 24-inch?
Take out the mirror?
Yeah.
So the PlaneWave CDK is a fixed primary mirror. And the spacing between the primary and the lens and the secondary mirror, it comes down to millimeters. It's super, super touchy with distances. In fact, even collimation, we had to be super careful not to introduce too much forward motion or even back motion in that mirror. Taking out the primary, we would have had to completely reconfigure it using their special, they call it I think it's called a raunchy adapter. I don't know why they call it that, but we don't have one. And I would have been very nervous taking out, like when Bob talks about cleaning the mirror, I'm glad I get nervous, or not the mirror, the lens in that telescope, more or less taking the 24 out of this one. But I feel like it's not so, the mirror is a very large part of it, but this is the cage mechanism, it's the shutters that cover it up, it's got hydraulic drive on it. I mean, the secondary mirror it's just like an 8-inch mirror up there. I mean, there's a lot of components on this that really weigh it down.
Doesn't PlaneWave send a special tool to measure the distance between the two?
They do. It's called like the raunchy adapter, or Ronchi adapter.
Okay.
They don't send it to us. It's another port you got to get. We are debating on getting it, but at this point we don't require it. So I'm unsure if we're going to pick it up. I don't see us having a situation like if it was a portable telescope in a way, like if you get them on a cart, like then I would definitely have to pick that up. Now, one thing, so when we talk about the telescope, Yeah, the CDK24 is really fantastic optics. I mean, everything looks fantastic. But what really got me excited is the L600 mount. This mount has so many amazing features to it. First of all, the entire mount is I'm gonna say it's modular, but everything opens on it, and you can put into it whatever you want. We've added to this power strips. We added USB hubs. We've got the control computer inside there. Everything we need to operate the telescope is all inside the L600 mount. So there are no wires that come off of this thing anywhere. The only wire that comes off of the PlaneWave, the entire setup, is just the AC wire that comes out of the bottom of the pier and plugs into the plug that's on the pier. That's it. And coming from using the Meade, where you're constantly running into cable hangers, you got wraparound issues, you got that silly hand, they call it, it's a paddle, really good paddle, the thing's huge. Was a nightmare, especially looking in the north direction with that telescope. With this telescope, everything is very consolidated, it's very easy to use. And the L600 mount also is a direct drive. I'll get into that in a minute, but that's very exciting too. I mean, this is some of them. This isn't even all of the compartments here. You got 2 on the bottom here. You also got 2 on the sides on the bottom. The entire outside of the L, the inside of the L has some as well. I mean, you can really stack into here whatever you want. And PlaneWave is really cool about warranties. Their attitude is you can modify it any way you want. It's not going to really void your warranty. I said, can I replace these fans? Because they put velocity fans in here. So they're super loud. They're like, yeah, go ahead, just take them out and put them wherever you want. And I said, can we replace some of the circuits if you wanted to inside? They're like, yeah, sure, it's no problem. I'm like, then this is going to void the warranty? They're like, no, you're good. So that's nice. And then here, this is our control computer right here. Now, the PlaneWave software it's very resource intensive. And what we were using was just not cutting it. So what you got to do, you're running several different packages. PlaneWave is working on this problem, so this is PlaneWave interface 3. This is PlaneWave interface 4. PlaneWave interface 3 will control the field derotator, it'll control your focuser, it'll control your fans, but it won't control any of the motion of the telescope. PlaneWave interface 4 will control the drives, will run the clock drive. You can use it with any kind of stellarium application you want, or star charting app, but it won't control any of the accessories. The field derotator requires this running for it even to work with the old version, so you have to run them both together. And it gets a little bit heavy, so what we did is we installed a single board computer that had a lot. What it came down to was how many PCI Express lanes. I'm not going to get into like the tech too much here, because I don't want to bore you with that, but the device we had in there had 1 PCI Express lane, and it was just saturated. Having this device in here, this device has up to 16 PCI Express lanes available, and that allows us to be able to use it, but it also puts the PlaneWave on the campus network. And being on the campus network means we can connect to it from any device we want. Phones, laptops, we can go into the Sky Theater and control it. Definitely is nice on the cold nights. So you're gonna have to listen to this here. This is interesting. So the CDK600 with the L600 mount utilizes a direct drive motor. So the direct drive motor, I mean, most of you guys know what it is, it's largely just magnets moving around. And the idea is to remove gears, anything that's backlash in it, and they have encoders that they set up along both axes. And the encoders are super precise, so you have to tune these motors for whatever you have on them. So whenever anything you change an accessory, and then you save these different tuning profiles. Now, if you look here quickly, you can see that it's moving a little bit, just a little bit back and forth. This is a 2 hertz frequency. We're looking at 2 tons per second. This here, you'll notice it's moving a bit faster. This is 8 to 10 hertz frequency, where it's moving a bit quicker. But this one here is what everyone in the park freaked out about. Yeah, listen to this. See if we can hear it on this one. This is 500 to 1250 hertz. Instead of seeing it, you hear it. That's how fast those encoders can read on that encoder. Those sensors on the encoder. When we were doing the first tuning, PlaneWave had warned me that it was going to be loud. We had people coming in, so we had the dome facing the playground. So all the sound is going out towards the playground in the parabolic dome. So everyone started coming over, and they're like, I knew there were aliens here. It was definitely quite a hit in the park that day. But we had to do this for every train we use on the telescope. So this here is our ZWO imaging train. This is the ASI 1600 Pro with the ASI EFW. We have a 7-filter EFW, so we got a full broadband and our band set in there. This here is the IRF90, which is a field derotator, and PlaneWave's EFA, their focusing, electronic focusing assembly. This is a hand controller for focusing, but you only need it if you're doing public observation. We control the telescope with an Xbox controller, compliments of PlaneWave, which I thought was great. I mean, I use a Wiimote on mine. This is with the Canon RA on it. Working with a fixed primary, though, was a big change for us when we moved from the LX200 to this. So the LX200, yeah, we have mirror shift, right? I mean, they all have it, but you get used to it. But having that amount of focused travel is really awesome. Working with this was a reminder. It almost took me back to those days of trying to work with the F4 Newtonians, where you have such little focused travel you can work with. With the fixed primary, you get this little gap right here. That's all the focused travel we have on the EFA. That's all the focusing we can do. So with a series of adapters, from an imaging perspective, it's easy, because you're not changing them out. But from a full frame perspective, the vignetting is terrible. Now, PlaneWave warned us about this, that there were issues with full frame sensors with the telescope, but they didn't get to the point of how bad it would actually be. So these are flat fields. This is the dirty luminous filter, sorry about that. But this is with the Canon RA, this is with the ZWO 1600. Now the ZWO 1600 is a crop sensor, and it's a full frame sensor on that Canon RA. So if you're imaging with a Canon RA, you're not gonna fix this vignetting with a flat. You have to actually crop it. But from a full frame perspective, or from a crop sensor perspective, you have very little vignette. It's actually quite clean. The optical train, this was tricky. Because getting a diagonal on the telescope and getting into focus without having to change out all of your adapters with each eyepiece became a tricky process. We actually had to go back to PlaneWave and have them replace the collar that they gave us that sat between the field derotator and the backplane, because the one they gave us just would not accept the diagonal. Now in here, actually, just by coincidence, that's the Orion Nebula in there. But one of the hardest things we had to do with getting the telescope operation was getting it able to use with the public. And we had to integrate this slit collar device on the back of the focuser to be able to help us with getting things into focus with different eyepieces, because it was definitely a problem. And another thing we ran into, which was actually kind of funny with this telescope, is the pictures don't do it justice. This telescope is big. It's really big. And it's black, and the edges are rigid. And there's big bolts everywhere, and there's devices all the way around it. When you're standing behind it, it almost looks like it's going to eat you. And we started having kids come up when we first installed it, and they didn't want to come up. They were like, no. They were scared of it. And even some of the adults were like, yeah, that was a little intimidating. I think I'm gonna skip. So we had to try to figure out ways to make it look nicer. And we were gonna stick stickers of like strawberries on it, maybe like a nice picture of Pluto so everyone feels good. But in the end, what we did is we just did some modifications to the height of the platform, and it seemed to fix the problem.
What's the advantage of the corrected dog Kirkham compared to some of the other
So,
optical trains?
The corrected dog Kirkham has a flat field, edge to edge. So you don't have to worry about integrating a field flattener. You don't have to worry about having issues with stars being off on the edges. And additionally, you have on the back of the telescope, these draw tubes are huge. Like we're bringing them down to 2-inch here, but we have to bring it down to 3-inch in here, and above that, it's almost a 5-inch draw tube. So from a vignetting perspective, if you're not using a full frame, it is very nice. As far as other telescopes that are out there, so when you're dealing with an RC, for example, like a Ritchie-Chrétien is going to have a very large central obstruction as it relates to its actual aperture, and there's no correction. You're going to get a lot of distortions in your field on the edges. You're going to need to use a field flattener, and you're going to have a very dark center. It's not very good from a public observation perspective. If you're using just a regular Dal Kirkham, like the Officina Stellar, you have to be precisely centered when looking through that ocular, or you're going to get aberrations. And I even see it with the corrected Dal Kirkham. Like if you move around and you're looking through it, you do get a little bit of an aberration, but it's not that bad.
Is that the same one, any size corrected dog Kirkham?
What's that?
Is that the problem you have with any dog Kirkham?
Yeah, that's a problem with the Dal Kirkhams, is that you've got to be perfectly aligned for them to function properly. And that's why that's what PlaneWave did with the corrected Dal Kirkham. They integrated lenses, additional lenses in between the secondary and the focusing assembly, or the backplane, to correct that problem. So the corrected Dal Kirkham doesn't have that problem as much. It's there, but it's not as dramatic or as robust as it is in the regular Dal Kirkham. So here's some of the images that we started capturing. So we started working with the CDK, the Canon RA, and we wanted to try to find out where we are with exposure, where we are with actually tracking, at what point do we need to integrate guiding, how well does this direct drive motor work, how does the derotator going to work with it. And this is 120-second exposure, and this is severely overexposed, this object. This is NGC 2392, the Eskimo Nebula. And we have additional data on it that I haven't processed yet, but everything in here is overexposed. And that was quite astounding, because when I worked with the 16-inch, that exposure time was questionable. Note that every one of these images in here is unguided.
What, unguided?
These are unguided. They're tracking, but we're not using a guide camera. We're not using we're not using the off-axis guide. So this is Messier 100. This is actually the very first image we captured with the telescope. And we captured this image when it was winds were gusting over 35 miles per hour. The L600 drive will compensate for the wind. You watch it on the tracking graph and you see your tracking graph is really skewed, but you don't see any tracking anomalies in the data itself.
You're looking pretty good on the edges there too.
So this is cropped because this is with the full frame again. So we have to crop it, otherwise you're going to get severe vignetting. But I didn't put it in here, but one of the images in here has a galaxy that was right on the edge. And though it is in the vignetting, it's just as sharp as it is in the center. And that was fantastic. Even outside of the vignetting issue, it was still nice and sharp. Issues we run into with it though is using a field derotator, we have to correct the diffraction spikes in post, because the diffraction spikes become very blurred. This here is Messier 109. This is about 5.5 hours of integration, 120-second exposures at ISO 1600. This is also in the wing. And these galaxies we're going after here are galaxies like Messier 109, Messier 100. They're small, they're dim galaxies. We're trying, one of the projects we're doing at Frosty Drew is we're re-imaging the entire Messier catalog. And we've been waiting to get the PlaneWave in here to start working on some of these smaller galaxies. This here is Messier 65. This is one of the Leo triplet galaxies. In the field here, look at how many background galaxies are in here. The majority of the stars you see in here are background galaxies. In this case, the dust lane is very pronounced. You can see the warp on the galactic plane. And then this is Messier 82. And this, I was talking about this earlier, this Messier 82 image, we captured this while waiting to do something else. Like it wasn't even planned that night. We had 3 hours of time to kind of kill. It was in a good position, so we said, you know, why not? Let's get it. This is 3.5 hours at 120-second exposures at ISO 1600. We do have significant amounts of data sets with the 1600 as well as ZWO, but with the amount of aperture we're dealing with at f6.5, the data sets are quite overexposed. And we're still getting used to the idea of having this much light to work with. You know, dealing with most of the telescopes we've been working with, the Meade telescopes, working with the Orion telescopes, we're used to doing long exposure sets and cranking the ISO a bit in the gain. When we're working with these objects, we have our gain set to 0 on the ZWOs, and we're still overexposing half the time. There you have it.
Well, what's the substrate on those mirrors?
What's that?
What's the substrate on those mirrors?
So the mirrors are Pyrex glass.
What, Pyrex?
Yeah, so they have Pyrex glass on them, and I believe the coatings are done at PlaneWave. I mean, everything's done on their campus in Michigan. So it's aluminized. But
How come they didn't use Cervit or Zerador or something like that?
what is it?
How come they didn't use one of the low expansion glasses instead of?
Well, I'm sorry, it's not Pyrex, it's quartz. I'm sorry, it's not Pyrex. It's quartz glass, and they did it because of that, because of thermal expansion, right? So they used quartz glass. My mistake.
What are you gonna do when you have to recode it? 10 years down the line.
Well, hopefully we don't have to do that. If we gotta recode it, we'll send it out to PlaneWave. They'll probably deal with it.
Sure, but you gotta use someone with the optical train.
So I guess we haven't really addressed this with PlaneWave yet. This is in the, so one thing I will say about PlaneWave is that they're really great with support. And I've been on the phone with our contact. The contact we started with, Bill Dean at PlaneWave, was a person I've been working with pretty much exclusively since. And he's been up with me on the phone from 4 o'clock in the afternoon all the way until 6 o'clock in the morning. Passing through issues, working with stuff. I mean, they are dedicated people. I mean, Bob's heard some of my complaints about PlaneWave, but overall, their other side is great too. When it comes to issues with the telescope, they seem very interested in writing them. I'll definitely say that. We haven't had any issues where they kind of stick us with something. But if we do have to do that, I'm sure we're going to have to ship it back to them or dismantle it ourselves. They do have text they can send out, but they're not cheap. I know Matt Dietrich was in the area. He's one of the guys. So. We have a field derotator on it. Yeah, so we use the IR9 as field derotators. And we did have, so we wanted to go with the all-hazardous configuration for several different reasons. One, it's pretty large the way it is in the observatory today. The pier is in the center. We want to make it easy for the public to get to it. And we weren't too sure how things were going to work with that. I'm going to switch this over. Right here. Yeah, so the IRF-90 is actually it's fantastic. A few things about it in comparison to what we're used to doing with the Meade is it's fully digital. So everything is controlled through the control panel in PWI3. We can save positions in it that we want. So when we hook up, say, like the camera with the adapter is off to a position, it doesn't thread on properly, we can have presets saved for each camera to bring it right back to the right position. And we've never run into any issues with the rotator so far. It's spot on. So I'm quite impressed with the ability of that rotator. We'll see how it works after a few years on the soft pollen.
Just curious, somebody have a job with similar magnitude on the ground. What was the rigging? What did the rigging have?
What was the what?
The rigging cost.
The rigging cost. So we worked out a deal with formerly the brass rigging. One of our team members does work with that rigging company, and we had gone through different ideas of how we were going to get the telescope in. We talked about maybe building a gantry. We talked about perhaps using one of those bucket loaders to get it into the observatory. And it was what Mike, one of our team members, had suggested. Well, how would we actually do it right with a rigger? He spoke with the rigger, and we got the cost for the entire operation was $1,800. Which $1,800. So, and that was cheaper than it would have been. That was about a little bit more than half what it probably would have costed us. We were looking probably about a $3,000 installation cost. And they were on site for roughly 4 hours.
Very good.
Yeah, and they were extremely professional. Like I can't say enough about like watching the riggers do their thing and how they like moving things. Like I'm not like I say centimeter at a time. Like I'm not kidding. Like they had one guy sitting in the door and he wasn't even on a radio. He's just waving and signaling to the guy all the way in the crane. And they're moving things a centimeter at a time, which is fantastic. So, and they worked with all of our hangups that we had to deal with too. Like we were like, oh wait, we got to lift it back off. And they were like, yeah, sure, no problem. So,
What did you do with all the equipment you've taken out?
so I wanted to pack it with M80s and explosives for Halloween and blow it up, but I was overruled. So what we did is we took, we have a Lost Mandy G11T, which is the new version of what the Titan used to be. And we have the JMI wheelie bars, it looks like a rover. And we converted an outside structure to a holding place. And now we're wheeling out that 16-inch on the Lost Mandy with the JMI wheelie bars on the public nights. And we can image with it as well. So we're still retrofitting some components. It's got really bad mirror shift, so we're gonna lock down that mirror. And we're probably gonna put like a moonlight on the back of it. So the LX200 is in its next stage of its public outreach life. So.
Is it hard to train some of your observatory crew to operate your new telescope? Your observatory crew, is it hard to train operators to operate the new?
So the telescope is intimidating. And all the different components and all the noises it makes, it definitely seems to intimidate people. But I would have to say that overall, after working around the clock with this telescope and learning everything about it, I wrote all the operations manuals. I wrote the training courses for our interns and for our team members. It's actually pretty easy to use. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, it does what it's intended to do. I think that's a good way to put it. And it does it so well that you don't have to worry about problems. So like the Meade, when we had the Meade, we had a public outreach. If someone's like eyelash touched it, we'd be like, don't touch the telescope. With this telescope, you can grab it and you can push it all the way around as hard as you want, and it snaps right back. Like it doesn't matter if you're holding it; it doesn't damage anything. Like it's great. And we've had people in the general public. We had a kid the other night grab on and like pull it all the way down, and half the team members are wincing. But I'm like, it doesn't matter. And just so like, hey, listen, let go, so it can go back where it needs to go, and it just pops right back into position, and off you go. So.
How about remote observing? Are you going to open the scope up? Are you going to open the scope up for remote observing?
We're just getting into that discussion now. We have the capabilities to do it. The last thing we have to do to get that fully working is fixing the automation with the dome.
Yeah.
And I'm probably gonna, borrow some ideas from Bob over here with what they did up at Brown. But once that's functional, it is on the table. It hasn't been decided yet, but it is definitely something we're considering.
This might seem like a funny question. Where's Frosty Drew Observatory?
Where is it? It's in the middle of nowhere. So if you go down to Charlestown, Rhode Island.
No.
So it's on the south coast of Rhode Island, pretty much right in between Westerly and East Matunic. So we're inside Ninigret Park, and we're about maybe 100 feet from the border of the Ninigret National Wildlife Refuge, which goes all the way out to the ocean. So we're in a very dark spot, and we're right off of Route 1, so it is very accessible as well.
What do you want?
We do our public nights on Friday nights, and this time of the year we do 7 to 10, but like Bob was saying, we were out there until 4:30 this morning, so we're there pretty late. And we're there, we also have a rule, it's an unwritten rule, that we don't chase people away when they show up on our closed nights. So and if the moon's not up and if the clouds aren't out, there's somebody there working. Whether it's me, whether it's James, whether it's Derek or Sean or Jessica, there's a lot of people that could be there. And if you show up on those nights, you probably get a better experience than you would on a public night if you're a geek, because you can see what we're doing with the telescope. You can sit there and hang out with our astronomers. You can get a like almost like a hands-on look at the way it works, the integration and all that. On a public night, you get more of the, you know, like the public program. So if you showed up on a night where it was really nice out, might be better.
So any decent night, somebody's there?
What's that?
So any decent night, somebody is there?
Yeah, I would say 9 out of 10, someone's gonna be there. Usually it's James.
As far as the automation, the ATMs in Boston you're familiar with,
Yeah, I know they are, yeah.
well, they just inherited a 17-inch fully automated PlaneWave. And they just got it operational maybe 5 or 6 months ago. They moved it from where it was originally sited to the observatory site in Westford, I believe. But it's completely fully automated, 17-inch PlaneWave.
For as far as ours goes, like I would say that the only automation piece we don't have today is the dome. The only automation piece we don't have today is just the dome automation. Now that's the only thing we need left. Well, as far as the telescope goes, we use Sequence Generator Pro to do sequencing with the telescope, plate solving. It comes with its own plate solving utility as well. PlaneWave likes to use MaximDL, but for the coders in the room too, PlaneWave also makes all of their equipment accessible via API. And you don't have to press them that much either. I spoke this a couple hours with PlaneWave, and they sent me all kinds of Python libraries to write our own software to integrate with the telescope.
Is it ASCOM compliant?
Yeah. So they have ASCOM compliance. We use ASCOM today with it. But we're rewriting some of that software. We're going to open source it. So we're going to create a GitHub. So some of the different utilities that are required to do the steps that are in the PlaneWave manual. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, but they don't give you another option. You got to figure it out yourself. Require expensive software. We're going to rewrite those functions and open source it so there's an open source alternative to do it. So I would like to say that you guys should all plan to come down to Frosty Drew. You know, have like a Skyscrapers night or something. Just let me know when you want to do it. We'll do it on a night that's not a public night, so you got the observatory to yourself. You know, set up your cameras, do whatever you want, try to image with it. I mean, it's a really great asset, and I mean, I encourage all of you guys to come down and check it out because it really is a fantastic telescope. I mean, visually and photographically.
Where did you get the name Frosty Drew?
We were drinking one night, a brew, and it was really cool. It's our namesake. It's named after an individual who was Edwin Foster Drew, and his nickname was Frosty. And he was responsible for getting things moving to fight the integration of a nuclear power plant at the location that we're at, which used to be the Navy's auxiliary landing field. When the military decommissioned the base, a nuclear power plant was the highest bidder on the land. And he put together, at first, which was a petition, which turned into a coalition, and then a group called Concerned Citizens of Rhode Island that fought the power plant, and they won. And as a result, it turned into a National Wildlife Refuge and parkland. But he died shortly after because he had polio as a kid, and complications with polio took his life. So they opened up the Frosty Drew Nature Center as the very first entity in the new park as a memorial to Edwin Drew. Thank you. Yep.
Well, thank you, Scott. It was
Thank you very much.